A Flash in the Dark, Chapter 45, Reason in Anger. Oliver flipped back to his feet and glanced around, looking for Barry's telltale flash of gold lightning. Something smacked him from behind, sending him flying further into the alley. He rolled at the last minute, saving himself from eating asphalt. He just managed to move out of the way of a second streak of lightning. This time, though, the speedster pulled to a halt at the end of the alley. Oliver snatched 2 arrows out of his quiver and fired. Barry blurred as she moved. When she became visible again, she was smiling that same sinister smile. "You missed," she smirked. Oliver shook his head slightly. "No, I didn't," he stated. Barry just had time to turn and try and figure out what he meant when the dumpster behind her blew, sending her flying. She swore as she landed on her back. Oliver reloaded his bow quickly and fired before Barry had a chance to regain her feet. The arrow hissed as the needle end sank through Barry's suit and into her chest just below her clavicle. 2,000 milligrams of horse tranquilizer. Should be hitting you any second. There was a hiss of sympathy over the comms from Diggle and a gasp from Caitlin. "That's not going to be enough." The redhead spoke over his comms, and Oliver quickly loaded another arrow as Barry sprang to her feet and began to visibly vibrate. A mist of green vapor was surrounding her. Oliver couldn't get a clear shot at her moving like that. She stilled the vibration as the arrow that had been intended to end this fight before it escalated clattered to the alley floor. "That the best you got?" Barry's eyes flashed red again, and she raced toward him. She must have punched him, because he found himself flying backward into the burning dumpster. Then he was surrounded. Lightning and fire pulled from the fire behind him. He coughed and pulled an arrow from the quiver at his back. Firing through the smoke around him was difficult, but he managed to land a grappling arrow at the top of one of the shorter buildings that made up the alley. He pulled himself out of the inferno, only to hear a voice behind him. "Where do you think you're going?" Suddenly, Barry was at the top of the building, right where his arrow was attached. "I'm not done with you." Barry easily pulled his arrow out of the wall, and he plummeted, landing hard on his arm. He felt his shoulder dislocate and swore into the pavement. Jerking forward, he managed to relocate his shoulder in one painful motion. His comms came to life again. "Stop holding back, Oliver. She's gonna kill you." It was Dig. He knew his friend was right, but he didn't want to hurt her. "She heals fast, and Felicity is right. She's never going to get over it if she ends up killing you." It was Caitlin. Red boots came into Oliver's view in a flash of lightning. "Oh, don't tell me you're done, Ollie. I haven't even broken a sweat." Barry's laugh was downright sinister. Oliver sighed and snatched his bow, yanking 2 arrows out of his quiver and firing them directly at Barry's face. She caught them both inches away from her eyes. "Missed again," she teased. Oliver threw the knife he'd pulled out of his boot while Barry was distracted, and it flew true, sinking deep into Barry's thigh. She screamed, her leg buckling as she dropped the arrows. Oliver struggled to his feet as Barry pulled the knife out of her leg. "I still believe in you, Barry. You're better than this." Oliver felt like one moving bruise, but he advanced anyway. Barry pulled herself all the way to her feet as blood trickled from the wound. She threw a punch, luckily for him, at normal speeds. She seemed to be tiring. He caught it and pulled her arm down sharply, using his other hand to snatch a pair of cuffs from his belt and snapping them on the wrist he was currently holding. He drove his foot into the stab wound on her leg and spun her as her leg collapsed once more. He yanked her arms together and snapped the cuff into the other wrist as she howled in pain. Her hands pinned behind her back, she leapt backwards, her head driving into his nose. He felt it shatter and staggered backward as she tried to struggle to her feet. When his comms came back to life this time, it was Felicity. "Joe and Dr. Wells are almost there. You need to get her to look at the lights they've set up," the blonde instructed. Oliver grunted in confirmation and squared up again, wiping at the blood pouring from his nose. Barry was limping badly. The cut on her leg had opened wider with Oliver's kick, if the dark red staining on the leg of her suit was any indication. Her hands were still cuffed behind her back, but her eyes were still bright, glowing red. She lunged as Oliver heard tires screeching into the alley. She wasn't running at him at super speed this time. The injury to her leg was definitely slowing her down. He grabbed her by the shoulder, delivering a punishing blow to her torso and spinning her around one-handed. One arm around her shoulders, the other around her waist, holding her in place. The Star Labs van came barreling around the corner and turned sharply, the doors flying open, and suddenly the alley was a light show. Barry struggled in his arms for a second, but after a moment she went still. Then, as the lights died out, she went alarmingly limp. Oliver carefully spun her around. "Barry?" he asked, hoping against hope that it had been just that easy. Her eyes were squeezed shut. She groaned. "Oh, this is gonna be a special kind of hangover," she groaned. Oliver huffed a laugh and unlocked the cuffs. Barry wobbled and finally opened her eyes. They were slightly bloodshot, but they were finally back to their normal hazel. Oliver's smile turned more genuine as he slung one of her arms over his good shoulder. Barry flicked on her comm unit just as Cisco spoke. "So it was a tie." There were several long-suffering sighs as Oliver and Barry limped over to the van. They loaded up, and Joe handed Barry a first aid kit with a disapproving look at Oliver, then a sigh. He pulled the van out of the alley. Barry dabbed at Oliver's nose. "I am so sorry, Oliver," she began. Oliver shook his head slightly. "It's not your fault, Barry." He grabbed a bandage and helped Barry pull off her boot and roll up the leg of her suit so he could wrap her stab wound. "We do still have your metahuman to catch," he pointed out. Barry grinned at his use of the term. "Anything left in the tank?" he asked. Dr. Wells sighed and tossed a bar at Barry from the glove box. She grinned and bit into it, then spoke around her mouthful. "Well, if not, there's two of us, right?" She grinned. Oliver smiled, and Dr. Wells held out a flashlight from where he'd apparently been tinkering with it in the front seat. "This should cure you if Bivolo manages to affect either of you. There's only enough battery life in it for one use, though I was short on time." He sounded somewhat put upon. Barry nodded and took it, handing it to Oliver. Oliver slid it into his quiver and pulled a small bottle of sedative out of the first aid kit. "I'm going to take this with us. Might come in handy," he said, reaching into his quiver. Barry raised an eyebrow. "Do you have another arrow for dosing people things?" she asked, looking over his shoulder. Oliver glanced up at her. "Yes, I believe in being prepared, Barry," he pointed out. Barry chuckled and shook her head as Oliver pulled out another needle-tipped arrow and filled it with a sedative. "We need to find him first," she pointed out. Their comms came to life at that comment from Barry. "I've been working on it. Was a little distracted by the fight, but facial recognition software was running in the background for a while now." There was the sound of keyboard clicking. "Got him. He's headed towards the bank on 7th. Central City Gold Trust," Felicity called out. Oliver nodded and looked over at Barry, who held out her arms. "Shall we?" Barry asked. Oliver frowned before letting Barry take hold of him. "I hate you," he stated. Barry laughed as Joe pulled over to an empty alley. "No, you don't." No, he didn't. That was part of the problem. The two vigilantes were gone in a flash of green-tinged gold lightning.